Game preservation is coming up more and more in the gaming news space, and for good reason. Literally thousands of our collective favorites ever made are impossible to buy on modern hardware, meaning younger gamers may never have the opportunity or access to play through important pieces of video game and cultural history. There's no way I could ever run through all of the games I wish were purchasable on modern hardware, so I picked the top 30 I wish were still around on some type of eShop. Each of the games on this list are things I have either played for a substantial period of time or have rolled credits on. I haven't played every game ever made, and I'm bound to leave off some of your favorites. Let me know what those favorites are in the comments below, and let's talk about some great retro video games. With that established, let's jump right in with a pair of honorable mentions. Overwatch blew my mind in 2016, and it looked like it would be a new video game IP that would continue into the long term. But time tells a different story. Mismanagement of the game, terrible updates and metagames, and an awful sequel that replaces the original completely.
What is this?
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Overwatch, as it is in my memory, is impossible to play nowadays. It's a shame because back in the day I was hoping Blizzard would treat this franchise like a fighting game series, where every 4 years or so a new one is released with some heroes hitting the bench for an outing. And this setup would have allowed them to completely remix the gameplay with each entry, meaning they could have focused on that PvE experience with the sequel. Could have beens and what ifs aren't what this list is about though, but I felt like this deserved an honorable mention. My second honorable mention is Alundra. I never got around to finishing this Zelda-like 2D adventure game, but the bit I played is so fantastic. Since I never finished it, I don't want to misrepresent this title, but if it looks interesting to you, please check it out. With those honorable mentions out of the way, let's get right into the list. This is Rail Deal Games, and these are my top 30 games you can't buy anymore. Number 30. In 2017 and 2018, Crash Insane Trilogy and Spyro Reignited Trilogy released, and that is why my number 30 entry will possibly be a little contentious. The Insane Trilogy and Reignited Trilogy are purchasable on modern hardware, however, the original PS1 games are not. Those PS1 games are fundamentally different titles than the Trilogy Remake collections, and the reason I say this is that the physics in the games are slightly different, and the graphical overhauls foundationally change the way the games feel. I like retro games and I like retro graphics, so I would like the originals to be something I can revisit from time to time. I've still got my original copies of the games, but I would love to be able to have a copy playable on PS5 or Switch. Retro games have a coziness to them that modern games just lack, and even though those remake collections are undeniably fantastic, they don't hit the nostalgia the same way the originals, with all their clunky edges and foggy locales, do. And speaking of foggy locales, number 29. Silent Hill's most iconic feature is the way it used technical limitations of the PlayStation 1 to create an eerie atmosphere. The fog surrounding and permeating Silent Hill, functioning as part of the game rather than an immersion-breaking hardware limitation, is a stroke of creative genius at the hands of the developers. Classic survival horror titles always played around with sight and limiting of said sight to create dread and tension, something modern horror games have somewhat lost over time. This is part of the reason retro horror games are sometimes vastly superior to newer ones, and Silent Hill is a great example of that. There's something unsettling about the blocky graphics and smeared textures, and these things together make Silent Hill an uncanny valley perversion of the real world, much in the same way the Dark World is a perversion of Silent Hill itself. It's in these spiraling layers of dreaded dark the player gets lost in, and in a medium all about immersion, a game that evokes the feeling is far greater than a game that looks nice. Although looking nice can also be a nice boon to retro gaming, as we see in entry number 28. Part of what made the early Pokemon games so enjoyable were the aesthetically pleasing look of the pocket monsters. The first three mainline Pokemon titles demonstrated massive graphical leaps, and because of this, the first two games needed to be remade on 6th and 7th gen handheld devices respectively. Soul Silver is a remake of 1999's Silver version, and just like how Silver version added color to the franchise's mainline series, Soul Silver adds vibrancy to the original, putting the soul of the franchise franchise on full display. Soul Silver is everything a Pokemon game should be, and as such, it is my favorite game in the franchise. Nintendo hasn't given us a way to enjoy this game on modern hardware though, leaving the series' best set of Pokemon, progression, and graphics in the dust. Just remember, Nintendo, we can't catch them all if some of the games aren't playable. Playability is what matters most, and companies are leaving many dollars trapped in the confines of our plastic proxy credit cards. And in this day and age, you'd think rampant capitalism and the degradation of society would make them put products on the market, getting us to say,
I'd buy that for $1.
Number 27. And I would personally be dropping bans for some RoboCop content. RoboCop is one of my favorite movies ever made, and its sequels were always childhood favorites of mine growing up. RoboCop Rogue City came out this year, and I had a blast platting it. It was a pretty fun RoboCop game, and it also triggered my nostalgia a little when I had to destroy a bunch of these Terminator-like OCP robots. My mind immediately jumped back through time, called home by the sound of a 16-bit man's body dissolving to mush. I maintain RoboCop vs. Terminator is the best RoboCop game ever made, combining two of the best new IPs from the 80s into a nice looking game.
Nice.
There's so many things about this game that are simply iconic, from the sound design to the death effects of every enemy type. I so want this game to come back, and since Teon, the Rogue City developer, seems to have the video game rights for both RoboCop and Terminator, maybe this game can come back in some capacity.
I'd buy that for $1.
Sorry, I know, I promise. Definitely 100% pinky promise to not use it a third time. Number 26. Dino Crisis is gonna run you much more than $1 though, and buying a copy of this is gonna put you through a real financial crisis. Dinometrically different from RoboCop vs. Terminator, Dino Crisis is a survival horror game a la Resident Evil, pulling definite inspiration from Jurassic Park. Instead of stupid, slow-moving zombies, the player is up against stupid, speedy dinos. Instead of a manufactured virus demonstrating man's inevitable self-annihilation via scientific discovery and exploitation, man's crisis is the dynamic conflict between man and the prehistoric titans who owned the world before the first ape swung upon the vines. Dinosaur games are not typically scary, and the way Dino Crisis combines elements of Resident Evil with something everyone loves, like dinosaurs, is super interesting and effective horror. It's no wonder everyone wants a Dino Crisis remake. Even if a remake were announced today though, I would still want the original game on modern hardware because masterpieces are always masterpieces, even if a shinier version exists. You see, games like this are part of why retro gaming is so good, as a lot of modern games have me pulling an Ian Malcolm.
That is one big pile of shit.
Number 25. Games of yesteryear were cheaper and easier to make than modern games, meaning a lot of odd or experimental games came out in a consistent cadence. And since the main determining factor in whether or not you bought a game was the front cover and the back of the CD case, this is the way the original PlayStation worked for me. My family was poor growing up, but PS1 games were cheap, especially if you picked them up from a 10 games for $10 bin, which is the exact way my father picked out Battle Hunter once upon a time. Battle Hunter is an SRPG, and the main reason it was picked was because Final Fantasy Tactics was and has remained the favorite game of my brothers, father, and I. We all fell in love with it, and ever since then we saw another similar experience. Battle Hunter isn't a game of the same caliber, but it is still interesting. It's centered around making characters, upgrading them by taking them to the anime nurse, and taking them in procedurally generated battle zones using battle cards to move and attack. In essence, each character is only separated by their stats, character model, and attack animation. It's a simple game, but my family lost hours playing it together, passing the controller around as our player-made character's turn came up, making this one of the best co-op SRPGs I've ever seen, and actually, it might be the only one that exists like that. Number 24. Eternal Ice is also a unique take on the SRPG formula, instead combining the typical tactics-style gameplay loop with Pokemon crossed with Full Metal Alchemist's chimeras. Anime was starting to take a real hold in the West in the late 90s, so during this decade there were a lot of games that used anime cutscenes to facilitate important sections of the story, which is why this game has an intro anime scene that's actually not bad at all. Something else really cool about this game is the way it allowed you to explore the hub town center, something that was hopefully unique at the time for an SRPG. The fusing element to the gameplay loop was also fantastic, as each puppet you made would have certain stats and elemental affiliations that would help or hurt your ability to progress through the critical path. This is just one of those PS1 games that has more or less gone forgotten to time, which is such a damn shame since it is brilliant, unique in a lot of ways, and pleasant to play. Number 23. Not so much pleasant to play as dreadful, in a good way, Clock Tower is a hidden horror gem from the SNES era. In the shoes of Jenna, a recently adopted orphan, the player is given the task of avoiding the Scissor Man, a persistent stalker-type enemy. There's a few things about this that are unique for the time. Stalker enemies in horror games were pretty much non-existent because, well, horror games pretty much didn't exist when Clock Tower released. The only thing significant about Scissor Man is that he's a stalker enemy in a point-and-click adventure game. I don't typically like point-and-click adventure games, but because of him and the anxiety acquired in trying to avoid or evade him, this game stands out amongst its compatriots in the graveyard of a dead gaming genre. I've heard rumors of a remaster of this possibly coming out next year, in 2024, so if that actually happens, make sure you check out this wonderful gem. Number 22. Alongside the point-and-click adventure, the movie tie-in game has gone the way of the dodo. When I was growing up, movie tie-in games were a dime a dozen, and as that idiom applies, they represented quantity over quality in the gaming space. Despite this, some movie tie-in games rose above the pack, functioning as great games in their own right, and Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith is one of these. I got this game by trading my father a copy of Battlestar Galactica because I was super into Star Wars at the time. I didn't even know Battlestar Galactica was a recent TV show at the time, not having watched until much later in life. Revenge of the Sith follows the plot of the contentious conclusion to the prequel trilogy pretty well, taking liberties as necessary to enhance the gameplay mechanics and level designs. Something really cool about this game and the other movie tie-in games of the time is how the ending of the game is determined by the player. Choosing Anakin in the final showdown changes the ending of the game, whereas choosing Obi-Wan matches the movie's ending. Alongside this, Revenge of the Sith appears to have been somewhat inspired by Devil May Cry series, being a character action game from the character upgrades, level rankings, and gameplay style. Character action games are far less common nowadays as they were when Devil May Cry was the new kid on the block, and a lot of these movie tie-in games benefited from that market trend, including number 21.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it.
The Lord of the Rings Return of the King is one of the best movies ever made, so it was natural a movie tie-in game was going to be made alongside it. The Return of the King video game is genuinely one of the best movie tie-in games ever made, right up there with Toy Story 2 on the PS1. It makes sense that this development trend isn't feasible anymore because modern games have such inflated budgets and development times, it would be impossible to make a game tie-in for a modern movie anymore. Additionally, the film industry seems to be on a lower pedestal than it was when I was growing up, further making these types of arrangements not profitable anymore. If a movie video game comes out, it's always a spinoff like Alien Isolation, which honestly, I wouldn't mind more things like that. Remasters of the good ones like Return of the King would see no complaint from me either. These types of games have become history in this age of gaming, and Galadriel really says it best in regards to these types of games.
And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost.
Number 20.
Battle tanks.
Another thing forgotten and lost to time are destructive environments. There was a belief for a long time that fully destructible environments were going to be the future of games when I was younger, and for a time, a lot of studios were working on these types of gameplay systems. Red Faction, Future Tactics The Uprising, and Destroy All Humans all had either destructible landscapes or buildings, but even before all of them, Battletanks Global Assault allowed players to destroy all kinds of buildings with a variety of tanks. Being an arcade tank combat game, Battletanks allowed players to battle 3 other entities in capture the flag style combat scenarios. The level design is one of the most memorable aspects to this game, and I thoroughly love the way the developers allowed players to battle in many locations based off the real world, making monuments in those places available for destruction. Destroying the White House as a 4-year-old will always stay with me because at the time, it was so unusual for me to come across a game that mimicked real-world locales in any capacity. I remember how I left my copy of this game in the car once and it got damaged a little by the sun. My father repaired the disc and put a cover on it, and with bated breath, I hoped and prayed the startup screen would start and I would see the iconic 3DO stamp blazed across the CRT's pixels.
3DO.
This is the type of game that would be so fun to play with 3 other people in couch combat. Number 19. In combat, both couch and in the arcade was the theme of 90s gaming, and Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat exemplify this the most. I remember growing up watching my oldest brother and his friend playing Soul Calibur 2, passing the controllers around based on who lost. Gaming created communities back then, in person, real friendships and camaraderie, something that just doesn't exist with modern gaming. This entry in the list is for Mortal Kombat 1 through 3, as all 3 of these games and their separate versions are no longer playable on modern hardware. Classic Mortal Kombat is incredibly simple, making them the type of games that are easy to pick up and play with just enough of a skill ceiling to make them fun to learn for the dedicated player. Mortal Kombat has never been a super tight competitive fighting game, but it's good to have a franchise like that available for people who don't have the time to sweat a fighting game. I love classic Mortal Kombat. As you can see on my channel with the way I've been slowly working through ranking lists for each of the game's endings and fatalities. Retro games have a look to them that just can't be replicated in modern games, even in the indie sphere at times, and classic Mortal Kombat is a perfect example of this. I doubt we'll ever see a game use digitized actors in this primitive way again, despite how good it still looks. And more than that, think about this. When's the last time you sat in a room full of your 5 best friends playing a couch combat game and passing the controllers around? Have you ever done that? We need these types of things back, preserving and promoting the in-jokes that are made, the relationships reinforced, and the memories immortalized. Number 18. Fame is immortality, and what's more immortal than having your face preserved forever in cyberspace? THQ dominated my early gaming life since they released a plethora of mediocre to okay games throughout the early 2000s. Wrestling was at max popularity in the late 90s and early 2000s, and you might be sitting there ready to sling the classic, but wrestling's fake and stupid. All I have to say to that is,
it doesn't matter what you think.
wrestling was all about attitude and masculinity, full of big guys beating each other up, and it was something I couldn't get enough of as a child. The performance, the pain, and the posturing epitomizes the art form, and in a lot of ways, I learned early on that wrestling is a type of soap opera. Everyone is a character in wrestling, making each character function as a possible friend or antagonist for the player characters I would play through the campaign with. It's kind of interesting, but this is the game where I started to learn how to evaluate the fun factor of a game based on the limitations the player would make. It's easy to give a player character max stats across the board, imposing godhood upon them. But early on, my brother and I decided to create limitations for characters. They could have high stats, but they could only be maxed in one category, demonstrating their proficiency at something over the other characters in the game. It was a fun way to play the game, and it set me up early on to like role-playing experiences. Some something that still exists to this very day. Just like I'll take all the days my cousin and I spent playing Here Comes the Pain at my grandma's house. It was a bonding experience for us, and social bonding is what games have always been for me. This, along with the next entry, were those bonding games. Number 17. Every kid loves dinosaurs, so it's a no-brainer I loved Godzilla growing up, and to be honest, I still do love this big silly lizard. It's crazy to me that Godzilla games have gone by the wayside, because it seems to me Godzilla and his menagerie of monsters should be a slam dunk win 100% of the time. With the proper vision, great game design, and an appropriate budget, Godzilla could come back into the modern gaming sphere like this. I like the way this game has an almost comprehensive cast of Godzilla characters, allowing players to romp around certain cities in battle royale casual fighting fun. Something I always wanted to do was to get a multi-tap to play this game with 3 other players, which is also true of Here Comes the Pain. It's one of those things where I think my friends and I would really have a great time playing this, because this style of monster mash game just doesn't exist anymore, and it's the type of gaming experience that's locked completely in the past, much like actual dinosaurs. Number 16. Silent Hill is one of the biggest victims of the 7th generation. For most of that gaming time period, horror games were tossed to the wayside, and on top of that, Japan's prominence in the gaming space fell drastically as Western developers started releasing their Uncharted's, Gears of War's, and CODs. It's a shame because Silent Hill 3 is one of the best horror games ever made. There's a beauty in the blood, the dark decadence of Silent Hill's psychosocial panoramas, the shadow of closeted skeletons brought to bear as Cheryl and the player are forced to confront the inner depths of their personal shame and despair. Twinkling in the dark, Cheryl is the Twilight Princess of this game, shining through the dark history of her past and the tangled web of how she was traumatized from an early age. Number 15. The early 2000s were an interesting time to be alive for. Media across the board saw a push towards violence, partly because of Pulp Fiction.
What country you from? What ain't no country I ever heard of? They speak English and what? What? English, motherfucker! Do you speak it? Yes. Then you know what I'm saying. Yes. Describe what Marcellus Wallace looks like. What? Say what again? Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you, motherfucker. Say what one more goddamn time.
Edginess edged its way into game design, and more powerful hardware created a push for more realistic looking games, even for traditionally fantastical franchises such as The Legend of Zelda. Twilight Princess is the product of these conflicting cultural factors, representing everything people discovered they were interested in during the emo years. The grittier look of this Zelda title is the result of these factors, and I always hear a lot of people say it hasn't aged well graphically as a result. I don't agree though. To me, graphics should match art direction, each boosting the other, and in that way, most 6th generation games look great. I like those low poly games, and I'm happy we're starting to see indie developers take up a low poly aesthetic, because there really is something special about the blocky character models and texture work present in retro 3D games. I played this game for the first time in 2020, and I'm so happy I did. Other than a rough tutorial, a feature common for games from the mid-2000s to mid-2010s, the entire experience created a solid sense of adventure, full of zany characters, climactic bosses, and tricky puzzles. It's unlikely we'll be getting a new classic Zelda game from Nintendo anytime soon, and to be honest, this type of game design is truly pleasant to play through. And that's the reason games like this should be made available to modern audiences. Games exist in a sphere of abstraction, ceasing to exist whenever they are left to the past. Existentialism is an intrinsic issue in gaming, with the next entry diving deep into that philosophical concept. Number 14. JRPGs were the most prolific genre in the late 90s, and it makes sense considering Squaresoft released genre-defining JRPGs every 6 months or so by the end of that decade. One of those games is Xenogears. Philosophical pondering and analytical wandering characterized the writing for the golden era of JRPG, and this type of writing essentially doesn't exist in modern gaming. It's really risky to make a statement or to ask a question in the political zeitgeist of the 2020s, whereas politics and philosophy during the late 90s was nowhere near as polarizing. As such, Squaresoft found it alright to establish moral quandaries to the player, not necessarily resolving them on the side of an ambiguously defined objective good. With that being said, it's not like Square could just do whatever they wanted. They did change the name of the final boss from Jehovah to Deus, because having the Christian God being the ultimate final boss just wasn't going to go down well in the United States. Christianity was so much stronger in the United States back in the 90s, its hold over everything weakening a lot this century. Likewise, JRPGs' hold on the console gaming market has also gone down the drain this century, meaning that all of the best games in this genre are lost to the past. The only way to enjoy something of this style is to go... And it was impressive how Squaresoft was able to manipulate and remix the way JRPGs worked from a gameplay sense too. Xenogears is different from the Final Fantasy titles of the time because of the combo system, where you're able to input combos with each character to create more powerful attacks, and the gear system, allowing you to do combat in these huge mechs. Mecha anime was at its height of popularity in the 90s, and it's about time it becomes popular again. Number 13. I have a complicated relationship with Mario. Traditionally speaking, Mario games have always tapped into the deepest well of rage I have. The first game to start changing that is Super Mario Galaxy, which is to this day my favorite Mario game. I just love the creative way Nintendo shifted prototypical platformer design tropes, creating an experience unlike anything else that exists in the genre. The way Nintendo designed truly three-dimensional levels, giving the player the ability to walk around objects while still being gravitationally attached to them, is fascinating. While Nintendo didn't invent this idea, Insomniac did something like this in Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal in 2004, they perfected it. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not playable on modern hardware, which is mind-blowing to me because Nintendo literally released Super Mario Galaxy through the 3D All-Stars collection. You'd think something claiming to have all the stars would include the second Galaxy title. I guess 3D most of the stars just doesn't sound right though.
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
I'm in the minority of people who like Galaxy more than Galaxy 2, but both games are top of the class Mario experiences, and it is a sheer travesty that the sequel is lost in space. Number 12. It brings me no small measure of annoyance when half of a franchise is playable on modern systems, but the other half is locked beyond the gates of defunct hardware. The Fatal Frame or Project Zero franchise is one of these. Starting in 2001, Fatal Frame has been a mainstay of the horror genre, at least until its last entry in 2014, Maiden of Blackwater. The thing is, both the fourth and fifth entries of the franchise, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse and Maiden of Blackwater respectively, have been released on modern hardware, leaving only the first 3 games left behind. It's frustrating because all 3 of these games were purchasable on the PS3 store, yet for some reason all of the classic games on the PS3 store no longer work on PS5. I know the hardware is different and that makes games not work from that angle, but there's no way a multi-million-dollar business like Sony or Nintendo can't figure out a way to design a virtual console or emulator that works with the PS5 or Switch, allowing everyone to keep their full digital library, when modders can create emulators for console hardware on PC, making all of these games playable on a platform they weren't playable on originally. That's peak irony if I've ever seen it. How many hundreds of dollars did we all spend individually on these virtual products to have them no longer work for seemingly no good reason? I still have my PS3 with all 3 of these games downloaded, so it's something I can deal with, but these are some of the best horror games ever made, and they're not purchasable anymore. I'm going to give Koei Tecmo a little bit of the benefit of the doubt since they have remastered the 4th and 5th games. There's a chance they'll remaster or port the original 3 at some point, and if they are working on it, then I'll consider my concerns corrected. The first 3 Fatal Frame games gave us the camera obscura mechanic, a combat style not present in any other horror franchise. Essentially, it forces the player to look at the source of their fear in order to fight it, putting them in a risk-reward gameplay loop where they need to decide how long to wait before snapping the shutter closed on the ghoulish ghosties. It's a great mechanic, giving us a snapshot of what early 2000s game designers cared about while making games. Number 11. If there's any game that shows what the early 2000s were like from a pop culture standpoint, it's Def Jam Fight for New York. One of 2 games on this list locked in a licensing limbo. This and my number 1 pick are the 2 games that are least likely to ever have a shadow of a chance being ported over to modern hardware. Fight for New York brought together all of the major hip-hop and rap icons of the era, caricaturing each one into these physical fighter versions of themselves, and positioning Snoop Dogg as the primary antagonist. Def Jam is the celebration of the cross-section between pop culture, music, and gaming, creating a conflux of influences unlike anything else in the history of the medium. Fight for New York played similar to a lot of wrestling games at the time, with a more brutal twist. The goal is to line the opponent and chalk, not make them submit. The only permanent submission is the sleeper hold of death after all. The brutality of the sound design and combat matched the harsh lyrics of the music the artists themselves produced. I doubt he'll ever hear this, but Snoop Dogg is likely the only person with the influence and money necessary to bring this project out of the graveyard. So if you're listening, consider bringing some culture back into gaming. This game is fantastic and everyone needs to give it a look. Number 10. Rob Pearson from PlayStation Access is gonna love this number 10 pick. Vagrant Story, a PS1 JRPG released in 2000, in true vagrancy among the next-gen experiences of the burgeoning 6th generation. Vagrant Story is one of Squaresoft's last PS1 masterpieces, and after this, the JRPG Golden Age would end with Final Fantasy X in 2001. There's a beauty in the language of Vagrant Story which demonstrates a clear command over Shakespearean register, giving the game an old vibe. The Enlightenment feel of the writing mirrors the old feel of its graphics. Vagrant Story was the swan song of a crumbling genre, and it reflects that in these ways, with the gameplay demonstrating the way the industry looked to an action-packed future, eschewing the classic JRPG battle formula in favor of a more action-leaning one a la Parasite Eve. More on that one later. Vagrant Story allows the player to move as much as they want during gameplay, creating a gameplay loop where players are able to position themselves as they choose relative to their enemies. I truly love this approach to turn-based game design, and I wish it's something that would have taken off more during the early 2000s. Vagrant Story is a vagrant pulled right out of Fahrenheit 451, caring more about art, style, and the weight of language over copying modern gaming trends. Games just don't pay attention to the vibrancy of language anymore, refusing to even take risks with this detail of development. We read old books, watch old movies, and listen to old songs because we gain something by experiencing history with immediacy, and we should be able to do the same with old games. Games are culture, and if there were ever to be proof of that, Vagrant Story and other entries on this list are that proof. Number 9. Modern gaming is stifling at times with its rote design and bloated content, making retro games a real breath of fresh air. Breath of Fire 4 is as warming as the name implies, like a cozy chimney fire at the end of a cold winter day. Vagrant Story has awesome artistic writing, whereas Breath of Fire 4 has wonderfully drawn mastercraft sprites, each clearly handcrafted with the greatest attention to detail. The game is a classical JRPG in every sense of the term. However, Capcom did play with the formula a little bit with the way that the Dragon Gems system works. I also like the juxtaposition of 2D hand-drawn sprites with blocky 3D backgrounds, something Xenogears does as well. The way a game looks matters a lot, and even though modern games have quote-unquote better graphics, classical games like Breath of Fire 4 sometimes look better than even the best-looking AAA or most artistic indie game. Capcom was at the top of the sprite game during the 90s and early 2000s, and to this date, I don't think any developer has ever outclassed them in this specific respect. Number 8. Open world and open level systems were relatively new in the early 2000s, pretty much getting their first major start with Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001. A lot of games began to become more open during that time, like Jak 2, Destroy All Humans, and Tony Hawk's Underground. As a franchise, the Tony Hawk series was still pretty new to gaming by the time Underground released in 2003. Previous to Underground, they were arcade time level based games where the player would be set loose on a set of wheels within a small, carefully crafted locale. The goal was to get the highest score possible in the time given, much like how arcade games of the 80s and 90s were designed. Underground changed that in a big way. While not completely open world, Underground is open level. Once you enter a zone, you have free range to approach it however you wish, even being being able to get off your skateboard for the first time in the franchise. I remember this being a big selling point for the game, which might not seem like a lot, but when you consider how games were always designed with limitations, the freedom of being able to run around without a board or a time limit was still something to be excited for. Nowadays, with how all games are designed with player freedom in mind, I miss the days of how retro games were full of barriers, of obstacles the player needed to work around. Underground isn't so far down the openness grind rail to not feel refreshing in that sense, and the design of the levels, missions within those levels, and the presentation of the character's story and cutscenes are all simply fantastic. And I'll be forever forlorn at the fact I never got the chance to finish this game because my sister lost the disc the one time I let her take it to her room. Number 7. The 6th generation of gaming created loads of innovations in game design that still exist today, and one of those things is the cel-shaded art style. There were a lot of games from the early 2000s that used this, with anime games standing out as being among the most common. I think this is because cel-shaded graphics made the characters look like they came right out of the anime or manga. Other games like Okami and Wind Waker would use the graphics to create this watercolor aesthetic where everything just looks stylized and colorful. It's part of why Wind Waker is regarded more highly than other Zelda titles of the time, like Twilight Princess. It's not just the art style that holds up Wind Waker though. Wind Waker is simply the best Zelda game ever made, a statement I stand by even after finishing Tears of the Kingdom earlier this year. I like classic Zelda design, and the water world of Wind Waker is super cool to explore, and exploration is a key important factor in the success or failure of a Zelda title. The franchise was built from the ground up to be focused on simulating adventure, and Wind Waker not only does that, but also does it with a seafaring focus. Sailing across the ocean to find islands is fun, and playing Wind Waker guideless makes discovering those other islands way more enjoyable than any other type of exploration from the time period. Zelda is a franchise focused on telling and retelling the same rough story with the same characters in a new setting, and Wind Waker's setting stands out as the most unique in that way. Number 6.
A battle raged at the end of the first tournament. The forces of Earthrealm were facing their greatest challenge. Mortal Kombat!
Stories being retold and remixed isn't something only Zelda does. Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks takes the successful fighting franchise and puts it in the context of a 3D beat-em-up game. Shaolin Monks is literally one of the best spin-off titles ever made, retelling the story of Mortal Kombat 2. Once I played this title all those years ago, I actually expected more games to follow this trend. And what I mean by that is I expected more games to retell the older sections of their story or lore through other genres than these smaller spin-off titles. And in some ways this did kind of happen, though it wasn't a major industry shifting development trend. Atlus does do this with Persona 4 and 5, and honestly it is nice when studios do that. Doing spin-off titles in different genres allows the developers to tell the same story but present it in a different way, and this kind of reminds me of the way that we've remixed and redone a lots of classic stories, from Beowulf to Shakespearean plays. A great example of this is the way Kurosawa retold the story of Macbeth, but in a samurai setting, with his film Throne of Blood. Wouldn't it be cool for more franchises to do this? A big problem in media right now is that we've gotten to a certain zenith of capital C content, making it impossible to reach for new heights in long-running franchises. Taking a second to explore the same stories in a different gaming genre would be a great way of getting more content of any franchise without sacrificing the value of the story that already exists. Number 5. Taking something that already exists and remaking it into a product that feels completely different while also not sacrificing its original vision is exactly what happened to Resident Evil 2 in 2019. While Resident Evil 2 Remake is my favorite game in the franchise, the original holds up to this day in my boat. A remake will never replace the original if the original is a masterpiece, and that is the case with this game. Director's Cut is already on the PS5 store, and I don't know what is making Capcom drag their feet in regards to Resident Evil 2. I imagine it's only a matter of time before the game is added to the platform, and I hope it's added soon because I am due for a replay. There's a lot of reasons I love the original RE2, and most of it comes down to the design of it. Tank control survival horror games aren't bad in my book. In fact, I find them to be better than a lot of horror games coming out every year. There's a care to the design of RE2 that only Capcom can do, creating a tense environment, having the telltale RE feature of being fun to replay over and over again. Number 4. A game I would replay to the point of ad nauseum as a kid is Mortal Kombat Deception. MKD is either my favorite or second favorite MK game, and ever since its 2004 release, it's only gotten a PSP port made. For almost 20 years, this game has gone unpurchasable on modern hardware, and it is criminal that other people don't get to experience the experimental conquest mode, awesome puzzle combat side activity, the unique chess combat mode, and the stellar Onaga boss fight. I have a 30-minute video on my channel all about Onaga because he is my favorite villain from the NK franchise, and he is also one of my favorite villains in all of gaming. He's got an impressive form, and his place in the conquest mode is excellent, acting as a nice foil to Shujinko over the course of the game. Mortal Kombat is an important franchise for me and has changed my life, and my love for the series started here with MKD. Number 3. The Thing is one of my favorite movies from the 80s.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
And Parasite Eve takes the flesh-mingling body horror of that film and turns it into an important aspect of the monster design in this survival horror JRPG. Coming out in 1998, Parasite Eve has a similar combat style to Vagrant Story, with these two games being the only two I've seen use this type of ATB combat. As such, Parasite Eve stands out drastically against the backdrop of other PSX JRPGs coming out during the late 90s, and as an added boon, it only takes about 10 hours to get through. As I get older, I appreciate shorter games more and more, especially when those games don't feel too short. Parasite Eve fits that bill, and in the heels of Ea Brea, the character has to untangle the virulent plague of fleshy amalgamations coming out of the woodwork. This game is one of those franchises from the late 90s that showed massive, incredible promise, only to be let down by a middling pair of sequels. It also comes from that era of game where animated cutscenes were still pretty new, and Parasite Eve has some insanely grotesque ones. Just look at this cutscene and tell me you don't want to see the other enemies this game has to offer. Number 2. The PS1 trilogy of Resident Evil games are something else, and I think these games get a lot of hate for reasons I don't really consider valid. A lot of people criticize the tank controls and voice acting, but both of these features aren't necessarily bad. The bad voice acting not only has historical significance within the video game industry, but the tank controls are beneficial to the tense gameplay loop of games like Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Nemesis wasn't originally going to be the third numbered Resident Evil title. It was actually originally planned to be a spin-off title for the franchise, but because Capcom had agreed to release the first 3 Resident Evil games on the PS1, Nemesis got to be the canonical third game in the franchise. Because of the shorter nature of RE3, there was always a chance it would be a financial flop. Thankfully, that would not happen.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
The main reason for its success are 2 things: Nemesis and the Mercenaries mode. Nemesis may not have been the first stalker enemy in gaming. That title goes to Scissorman from Clock Tower as far as I know, but he is definitely the most iconic stalker enemy in a horror game. What made him stand out among his contemporaries is that he would literally sprint at the player, making him far more formidable than the typical Resident Evil enemy. Not to mention that he would later get a rocket launcher, further complicating the player's interactions with him. Another thing every RE title needs is replayability. Being replayable is an inseparable part of Capcom's approach to game design, and the way replayability in games work is variable. Replayability doesn't mean the main campaign needs to be enjoyable to play again, and again. It can also mean adding alternative game modes to allow the player to enjoy a game in a different way. Nemesis does this with a brand new mode: Mercenaries. Mercenaries is a genius game mode because it allows players to enjoy a new combat scenario with unlockable characters, each with different weapons. RE3 is my favorite game from the PS1 trilogy, and it was very nearly number 1 on this list. But there was one more game that is even more unpurchasable historically than RE3. So if you've watched this far into the video, I know why you're here. You want to see the star, don't you?
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Number 1. The number one game you can't buy on modern hardware is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. MVC 2 is my favorite game in the MVC series, and because of how popular Marvel has become over the past 15 years, I don't know if the rights for this game will ever be sorted out in a way where the game will ever see the light of day again. There's a barcade nearest to me. My friends and I go from time to time, and they have an MVC 2 machine. Whenever we go, we spend most of our time playing this game because there's simply no other way to play this title. What I love about MVC 2 is its roster. I'm not sure I've ever seen a crossover fighting game with such a stacked roster of characters, from RE1 Jill Valentine to Spider-Man. I've always wanted to be able to sit down with this game and learn some awesome combos with each character, coming up with some teams to run through an arcade mode with, but until the game is added to modern hardware, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to. An arcade 1-up cabinet of MVC 2 came out a few years ago, but it is so pricey, costing more than modern consoles themselves, that I can't afford to get one of these despite how much I'd love to. If it were ever added to modern hardware, I'd absolutely
Buy that for $1.
and all of you should do the same. And that's the list, my guys. There are thousands of games no longer available on modern hardware, leaving a host of gaming history locked behind obsolete hardware. Video game preservation matters, and I'd love to hear about all of the games you think should be preserved. Leave a comment telling me a game you wish was buyable on modern hardware. With only 30 games on this list, I know I've missed a ton of great titles. I had to leave off over 100 of my own favorite games from this list. While you're in the comment section, hit the like button if you liked the video, and if you'd like to see more really historical gaming content like this in the future, subscribe and ding that notification bell. Thank you all for coming down this nostalgia trip with me. Bust out those old machines and show some love to these begotten titles sometime soon. Have fun, gamers.